Okay, I think we'll get started. A little bit late, but not bad. So, welcome, and thank you for coming to the Halifax Colloquium. What is a colloquium anyway? It can be anything you want. It's an all-purpose academic talking exercise. But this particular one is the latest iteration of a series of law and policy dialogues that I started up back in 2019. My name is Rob Currie. I'm a professor here at the law school. And I had this idea, and some years I'm able to do it, which is to bring together experts on a pressing and current public policy issue, to highlight problems and to tease out ideas and to suggest solutions. So that's what we're here for. For the last 2 years, the colloquium has been supported by the Viscount Bennett Professorship here at the school, which I currently hold. And the professorship was one established by the late Viscount Bennett, who you might have heard of as R.B. Bennett, the 11th Prime Minister of Canada. Later he became a Viscount, which I think he thought was a better gate. Who could blame him? Bennett was big on paying attention to the international scene. That's in the paperwork that comes with the professorship. You've got to pay attention to the international scene. And the issue we're engaging on tonight is one that's extremely internationalized, and it's one where Canada's place in the international scene is at a really interesting crossroads. And I'm pleased to have with me tonight 3 distinguished speakers who will help us untangle this topic. And they are so distinguished and their resumes are so extensive that I'm just going to introduce them each briefly in alphabetical order. Dr. Peter German is President and Executive Director of the International Center for Criminal Law Reform at the University of British Columbia. He's a practicing lawyer and consultant. He was formerly a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He served as Director General of Financial Crime and Deputy Commissioner for the West and North. He's co-chair of the annual International Symposium on Economic Crime at Jesus College, Cambridge University, and has a doctorate in law from the University of London, focused on asset recovery. And Dr. German wrote a couple of bestsellers that you might have seen in the stores at the airport. Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering, which is published by Thomson Reuters. And he also wrote the Dirty Money Report, at the commissioning of BC's Attorney General, which in turn sparked the Cullen Commission of Inquiry into Money Laundering, which is something that will come up a few times tonight. And probably best, Peter is originally from Halifax. So he's delighted to be here. Second, Jeffrey Simser was Canada's first Director of Civil Forfeiture and served with the Ministry of the Attorney General in Toronto, Canada, Toronto, for over 30 years. Not only was he the first Director of Civil Forfeiture, I have to depart a little from Jeff's prepared biography. He essentially invented the concept here in Canada and put together that ministry that he so ably led for so many years. He's one of Canada's leading experts on money laundering and asset forfeiture law. He holds law degrees from Queen's University in Kingston and Osgoode Hall Law School. We won't hold that against him. He currently has a law practice in Toronto and provides advice, training, and support to law enforcement in jurisdictions across Canada and around the world. Mr. Simser is the author of 2 blazing bestsellers, Canadian Anti-Money Laundering Law, The Gaming Sector, and Civil Asset Forfeiture in Canada, which is the leading textbook in that area. We have it in our library. Will you go downstairs and sign for both of you guys in the library? Because then I can sell those copies of the book. Jeff has published dozens of peer-reviewed articles. He is not from Halifax, but he likes it a lot. And finally, last but not least, but last in the alphabet, Rita Trichur is an award-winning journalist who we are delighted to have with us here today. I read her stuff all the time, and you should as well. She's senior business writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail. She previously served as the newspaper's financial services editor. Rita returned to the Globe in July 2016 after spending about 2.5 years as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, where she covered the Toronto Financial Beat, and a variety of other subject matter. He has also covered financial services and economics for the Toronto Star and has held various roles at the Canadian Press and at the Ottawa Sun. Rita got her first byline at age 6 when the Toronto Star published her short story about a fish-stealing cat and paid her $10 for it. Fish-stealing cat, flash forward a few years, money laundering, I think there's a continuity there. Rita has journalism degrees and a political science degree and an MA in Canadian Studies from Carleton University in Ottawa. So I'm delighted to have her with us tonight. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank my assistant, Sherry McIntosh, who is the one who actually does all the work around here and was absolutely invaluable in putting this event together, not least after it got scuttled because of the labor unfortunateness that we had back in September. Sherry managed to put the event back together, and our speakers very graciously agreed to do another iteration of another version of it and come together. So, money laundering. If there was ever an exciting and front burner topic for our Halifax Colloquium, this is the one. It is in the news. It is big in Canada. Just last week, Canada's financial regulator handed out its largest ever administrative monetary penalty to a crypto service. The banks have been in the news over the last few years. Money laundering is an issue. It's an issue here as it is elsewhere. In Canada, we found out after the Cullen Commission, but those in the know knew that our economy is awash in dirty money. And lots is being laundered here, and we've got lots of issues to deal with, and our speakers, I suspect, are going to unpack those issues this evening. So what I'm going to do is allow each of them 15 or 20 minutes to speak, and then I will moderate a question period. The event is being recorded, so when I'm moderating questions, I will repeat your question as well so that it can be heard. Although, what do you think, Bruce? Will it pick up pretty much anywhere in the room? Ish. Okay, we'll make sure that we restate the questions. So, I will now introduce Dr. German.
Okay.
So, got you repeating this up.
Great.
Forward back.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much, everybody. What a pleasure to be here at Dalhousie University. First time in this law school. I've been in the old law school, which I gather burnt down some years ago. So nice to be in the new one. And thanks a lot, Rob, for all the arrangements and for inviting us in the first place. I'm absolutely humbled to be here again with Rita and Jeff, because we've spoken, the three of us, at different locations at SEEK. We just sort of end up together, and just an honor to be with them. Thanks, Rob, for making the arrangements, and to your staff. It was really great. So what I'm going to do is just run through about 20 slides, 1 minute a slide, 20 minutes before you cut me off, sort of give you the big picture of what we're talking about, because I realize some people in this room probably have no idea what we're talking about, and others know all about it. I also should mention in advance that I stacked the audience with friends. Really great to see you, Ross and Dave and Art. Where are you? And there you are. Friends from many years ago, and just so pleased to see them and the rest of you here tonight. So thank you for taking time. So, money laundering, what's it all about? Look, money laundering is really the back office of organized crime. It's all about organized crime, and these days we don't talk about organized crime, we talk about transnational organized crime, because virtually all organized crime has an international aspect to it. But why do people engage in organized crime? They engage in it to make money. It's all about making money. And when you make money, you have to do something with that money in order to be able to use it. You have to disguise it from the authorities. You have to somehow get rid of the paper trail. To do that, you can use all sorts of techniques. It's all lumped together and referred to as money laundering. If you were to talk about money laundering 20, 30 years ago, it would be very simple to talk about the techniques being used. But things have changed in our world, as we know. And so nowadays, with Let me see here, social media, artificial intelligence, encryption, sanctions, cryptocurrency. It's a whole new world out there for all of us, but also for organized crime. Drugs. We're going to talk about organized crime gets engaged in all sorts of different commodities. Organized crime's only interested in, as I said, the money. So if you can make more money selling coke than you can cannabis, or more money selling people or animals or environmental products or firearms, that's what you're going to do. You're going to go where the money's the best and the risk is lowest. Canada, unfortunately, we're such nice people here. We're a bit of a patsy internationally for organized crime. We've become a producer nation. We actually produce drugs here. Now, we all remember BC bud and cannabis, and the view was, well, let's legalize cannabis and everything will go away. Well, cannabis may not be quite the issue it was before, but certainly we are now on to much more serious drugs and so forth. So we've got issues with, nowadays in this money laundering world, we're going to talk about things like money service businesses, beneficial ownership, who owns what is a big issue, and civil forfeiture. And head of civil forfeiture from Nova Scotia is here. Thank you for attending. That's wonderful. So we'll talk about a lot of these different topics. Okay, this one. So what has not changed is that people die from things like drugs. And that's a picture from the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is probably one of the worst areas for fentanyl and drug deaths that you will find anywhere in the world, quite frankly. It's shocking. And so when people come out to Vancouver, we show them all the beautiful things, but then I always say, are you interested in seeing the downtown east side? It used to be a square mile or so, but now it goes on for miles. And it's nothing to go down back alleys and people are shooting up and people are essentially dying. You know, it's I've referred to it as an open air hospice, which is really what it is in many cases. You know, people bent over from fentanyl and so forth, and we're still, despite the numbers seeming to go down a little bit, we're still losing, you know, a certain number of people every day. So it's terrible. Okay, this is an old picture, but it makes a point that money is difficult to get rid of. It's harder to transport, it's easier to transport a kilo of, let's say, heroin than it is the money that will result from the sale of that kilo of heroin. You'll have so much money that, you know, it is more of a burden than trying to pack a kilo of heroin. So money can become a real problem for organized crime at the high levels. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about Colombian organized crime, Mexican organized crime, Canadian organized crime, you name it. Money is how sales take place at the street level, and it's a problem. So how do we deal with issues such as this, an abundance of cash? For those of you that this is an entirely new topic, we generally talk about money laundering as having three distinct stages: placement, layering, and integration. So what does that mean? That's actually our laundry machine at home. And when we moved into our house, I actually lifted that one up on top of the other one. And I don't know how I did it, but it's all about leveraging. So somehow, yeah, Ross being an engineer, I don't know how I did it, Ross, but it's probably something you taught me. But anyway, look, it's all about somehow getting all that money that you've made on your street sales or whatever it is back into the financial system, be it a bank, credit union, whatever, so that you can then take that money and start layering it, which means spinning your wash around. It's all about the wash, spin, and dry cycle. You spin it around so that law enforcement, if by chance they come after you, they're not going to be able to detect where this money came from in the first place. Or if they can, it's going to take them so long, be so convoluted and confusing that they'll give up, or the paper trail will go dry. And eventually that's what you want, is to get that money out of the system and be able to use it. Most money that organized crime makes is reinvested. Like any small business or large business, You need money to buy more product, and that's what they do. But you also want to cream off the profit. So those are, generally speaking, the three stages, and you will see this in any. Thank you. This is service above and beyond. Thank you.
No room in there.
No room. Yeah. Sorry, we had it before. I'm already flying. That's okay. So a few things about money laundering. There are no rule books. This is an absolutely changing environment all the time. The important thing is you want to stay as a money launderer ahead of the authorities. And generally speaking, they can do that. You will use other people to do your dirty work as much as possible. You've probably heard of, well, you know about Smurfs. Smurfs is a term that we use to describe money launderers who hire people to go and deposit money into various different banks, and then once it's in the banks, you can bring it together. But you don't attract attention because you've got a number of people depositing small amounts as opposed to one person walking in with a hockey bag full of cash. Structuring transactions, that's where sometimes our lawyers and accountants get involved. Corruption can be an issue. We're fortunate in Canada, we do not have the blatant corruption that you see elsewhere. Jeff and I have lectured overseas. We've lectured various different countries where corruption is just, you know, the name of the game. But, you know, in Canada, we can't ignore the fact that we do have a certain amount of soft corruption, I would say. And we always have to be on guard for this, because if organized crime can corrupt an individual, whether it's a bank teller or somebody at the motor vehicle branch or somebody somewhere, it can sort of facilitate the movement of money. And of course, legitimate cover stories, jobs, businesses. So the old idea that it's one thing to be engaged in organized crime, but if you can show some sort of a legitimate front business, it makes it that much easier. Okay. Facilitators and gatekeepers. So it's inevitably in our world today, you need people to assist you in terms of structuring transactions, and that's where lawyers and accountants get involved in this. Oftentimes, lawyers and accountants are really dupes. They are, you know, practicing in their little office, wherever it may be, and in comes a client, and the client sounds reasonable and has a lot of money and wants to do a lot of things with it. It's very tempting. But if you don't do your due diligence, you can quickly find that you yourself, you know, are vulnerable and or compromised. So accountants and lawyers, particularly lawyers with trust accounts, any organized crime figure would just love to get a hold of a trust account. If you've got a captive lawyer and a captive trust account, you can do all sorts of things, because it's very hard to find out what's in a lawyer's trust account due to solicitor-client privilege and various different things that we can talk about. So increasingly, you know, government is concerned about these issues. Internationally, we're concerned about these issues and about facilitators and, as we call them, you know, the gatekeepers, the professions that help us in terms of transactions. Finance Canada in 2025 issued a money laundering risk assessment, and you can find that, just Google it and it'll pop up. And essentially it says, this is our federal government, that Canada has become a piggy bank for international terrorism. In other words, we collect money that is shipped overseas and is used for terrorist activities. And whether that's Hezbollah money or whatever it might be, Canada is a soft spot in terms of terrorism, terrorist financing, you know, finding the money. And similarly with organized crime, some key findings of this money laundering risk assessment by the Finance Department. Organized crime groups and third-party professional money launderers are the primary ML threat. Illegal drug trafficking is the highest ML threat. Major threats, other major threats include fraud, trade-based money laundering, and tax crimes. Canada is an attractive source, destination, and transit point for proceeds of crime due to its strong, open economy and financial sector. So all the things that make Canada a great place to live also make it very attractive to organized crime. And terrorist financing, which we're really not talking about here tonight, but it's closely aligned to money laundering, is generally low volume, low value. Domestically, though, the consequences can remain severe. In other words, collecting money for an overseas organization may not seem like a big deal, but it can produce terrible results. Okay, so we've actually reached the stage internationally where there are now organized crime groups that their only commodity is moving money. They don't move drugs. They're not involved in human trafficking or any other types of commodity. They are actually specialists in moving money. And you can Google GMLOs or global money laundering organizations, and you will see examples in Europe, in Canada, in Asia of organizations that basically sell their services to organized crime just to move money. And they do it in a couple different ways. One is they will either do it for you or they'll train you how to do it. So that's where we're at in this game. And cryptocurrency, for example, has become very popular in terms of the money laundering world. So are underground bankers or non-registered financial institutions, informal value transfer systems. Here's just a flow chart. This is an RCMP flow chart from a case in Vancouver involving casinos. It goes back a number of years. It's a publicly available flow chart. It's in the Dirty Money reports, which are also publicly available online. And but it just shows the complexity of these money flows when individuals are laundering money. And it's not easy for police and prosecutors to pull these things apart. It can take years. And generally speaking, you don't have years to conduct a prosecution. It is a real issue for our criminal justice system. We won't go into that obviously in detail. Now we're finding that we have a financial intelligence unit in Canada, FinTrack, located in Ottawa, that collects financial information, suspicious transactions from banks and other reporting entities. It's existed since shortly after 9/11, but just recently it's really, gone into after the afterburner is on. We're finding a lot of fines are now being issued by our own Canadian regulator, saying that various different reporting entities are not doing what they should be doing. And TD Canada was just one example. They were fined, as we know, a huge amount in the United States, but they've also been fined in Canada. And almost on a daily basis, it seems, FinTrack is now finding various different organizations for not properly reporting suspicious transactions and so forth. We now also have, as a result of Trump 2, we have the Strong Borders Act, which we don't have a budget for, I don't think, but we have about $1.25 billion set aside for it, something like that. It has brought on additional reporting requirements for Canadian institutions. This is what I was talking about earlier. Canada is now a producer of illegal drugs. We've always been involved in the BC bud and cannabis, but now we're looking at methamphetamine. And we are supplying, we're filling the gap that has been created in Mexico. And I'll show you a picture here. This is online. This is British Columbia. This is rural British Columbia. This is basically an industrial production facility for methamphetamine. So, when Donald Trump says, Canadians are sending fentanyl across the border, well, we may not be sending fentanyl across the border to the U.S. In fact, the U.S. is probably sending more things to us than we are to them, like cocaine and firearms. But we are definitely producing illegal drugs. And in this case, in all likelihood, these drugs are not going to the United States. They're going to Australia. They're going to Fiji. They're going to New Zealand. There was just an expose on, I think it was CTV recently, about exactly this issue in New Zealand. And has anyone been charged? It's always the gardener. It's the person left, with tending the plant that gets charged. But we haven't seen any high-level arrests in this or similar takedowns. But this was, this is a huge operation. Canadian Olympian Ryan Wedding on the FBI's most wanted list, believed to be one of the world's leading drug traffickers. So Canadians, you know, have acquired a bit of a reputation. Here's an interesting individual, Shai-Chi Lop. You may recall, going back a few years, that the mafia, the families in the United States, had a commission, right, where all the heads got together. Well, the same thing has taken place with Asian organized crime, where the triads have essentially come together. They recognize that fighting is not the way to go. Working in alliance, working collaboratively is probably preferable, because it's all about making money. It's not about killing people. It's about making money. And Shai-Chi Lop was allegedly the head of the, I will call it the Asian Commission, the triads, and responsible for everything coming out of Southeast Asia, which is the Mekong countries, you know, the Cambodia and Thailand and Laos and so forth, Vietnam, which is a really interesting area, which is like an entire study in and of itself, because if you look at those countries, the border regions are the weak regions, and the border regions tend to be near the Mekong as it flows south from China, and you know that it's drug haven. Anyway, Shai-Chi Lop, the Australians take this stuff really seriously, and the Australian Federal Police were looking for Shai-Chi Lop for the longest time. He goes by various different names. He's been referred to as Asia's El Chapo. We all know El Chapo from Mexico, who's now residing permanently in Colorado. But Asian El Chapo was wanted by the Australian authorities as a result of his work there. And sure enough, they had an Interpol warrant out for him, and he was located in Schiphol at the airport in Amsterdam just as he was about to board a flight, and he was arrested by the Dutch authorities. Where was he going? Canada, Toronto. Why? Because he's a Canadian. He's got a Canadian passport. So he was coming home. It's the safest place to be. It takes years to get extradited out of Canada. Anyway, he didn't make it. He got caught by the Dutch authorities. The Australians then extradited to Australia. He's been essentially cooling his heels in custody in Australia for a few years, waiting for his trial. So Canada has not got too much to be proud of in this area. So just sort of in summarizing all of this, I'm at slide 19 out of 24. Thank you for your patience, folks. We're almost there. What is organized crime today? What does it look like? It's transnational. There's no question about that. We're talking about loose alliances. So, you know, we talk about our homegrown Hells Angels, eh? You know, our motorcycle gangs and that sort of thing. I like talking about them because so much organized crime is ethnic based, but I like talking about Hells Angels because they are that Caucasian ethnicity, right? And they will, just like any other organized crime group, they will work with other, whether it's Iranian organized crime, Chinese organized crime, everybody knows the role that they play. And they form these loose alliances, and then these alliances sometimes fall apart and they reform with other groups. They're not necessarily, as I mentioned at the outset, commodity specific. It's all about making money. So commodities shift over time. You know, we were told that we're going to legalize marijuana, so you know, life will be good. Organized crime will go away. Well, no, it doesn't quite work that way. Organized crime still loves cannabis because it can produce a better product. It can produce it faster. It can produce a higher potency of marijuana and so forth. But really, eventually, like with prohibition, the feds will win eventually in that area, but there's also cocaine, there's fentanyl, there's meth, there's all these other things. So they're not commodity specific, they're going to go where the money is. They'll also get involved in legal enterprises, again, as a bit of a cover. We call it when let's say drugs come over in containers. I live right beside the Delta Container Port in Vancouver, largest container port in Canada. And you know, we don't know what amount of drugs comes in, but we know lots does, and precursors come in. So sometimes, you know, you'll have, it's not as if there's a full container containing illegal drugs. It might be just a small portion of a container. And that's the challenge for CBSA, our border people. We call that tailgating. You throw in a little bit of illegal something with a legal cargo. And organized crime, again, generally speaking, at the high level, it's almost non-violent. You only see the violence more at the street level, because that's where people are fighting for drug lines and that sort of thing. But at a higher level, it's just not good for business. Transnational, it's network versus hierarchical, which is what I think finished saying. It operates almost like corporations, forming, reforming, illicit financial flows, that's the money. However, there's also an aspect that is probably of more concern than all of this, and that is when organized crime starts to merge with terrorism. And that's something that we've seen in parts of the world for a long time, but we haven't seen that in Canada till very recently. So if you think about recently, let's say British Columbia, we had, as they refer to it, the assassination of a Sikh leader in Surrey, BC, allegedly by, according to our former Prime Minister, an Indian government conspiracy to kill this individual. Well, whether true or not, the individual is dead. And it was probably for political reasons as opposed to anything else. So that is, and the killers are allegedly from a gang, an organized crime group. So you see this merger of organized crime and terrorism, which we're not used to. But that's not the only example. I think I've got a slide coming up. Anyway, commodities, as I mentioned, it can be any number of different things. The fear of merger of organized crime and terrorism, and this is the poster boy. I just love this guy, Damien Ryan. Not really, but you know what I mean. BC Hells Angel charged in international murder conspiracy, was among 3 people charged by the U.S. Department of Justice on Monday, this is some time ago, for allegedly conspiring to murder 2 people in Maryland. He was allegedly hired by an Iranian drug cartel connected to the Iranian government to kill an Iranian dissident living in Maryland, USA. And they went to a Canadian Hells Angel in Vancouver. Well, why would you? That's just so natural. But it didn't happen. As it turned out, the Americans thwarted the alleged conspiracy. Damien is cooling his heels in jail, along with 1 or 2 others that are named with him. But again, a bit scary when you think about it, because it is this merger of terrorism and organized crime. My view is Hells Angels should be an outlawed organization. They should be sanctioned, et cetera, et cetera. And if they continue to get involved in things like that, eventually our government will have to do something like that, as you see in other countries. Okay, so 24th slide out of 24. I lied when I said 20, sorry. Okay. What's happening internationally? There's lots happening internationally. And we have an organization called Financial Action Task Force. It was created by the G7, Canada being a G7 nation. And the Financial Action Task Force is a permanent body, and it deals with normative standards for the world to follow when dealing with money laundering and terrorist financing. There are 40 recommendations on money laundering, 9, I believe it is, on terrorist financing, and every country is supposed to toe the line. And every country gets examined by peer countries. Canada has always done sort of like okay, right, in our previous reviews. But there is now an FATF review of Canada. It's the first one in 10 years. And it's underway now, 25-26. The countries will be examined in Canada. Are you complying with the normative standards? There's some things that we are clearly not complying with. In our country, lawyers do not report suspicious transactions, etc. In other countries, they do. That's a violation of what? I think it's recommendation 22 of the FATF. So we are not in total compliance, but to what extent are we not in compliance? It's a big deal, and so you'll see a lot of things coming up out of Ottawa. You'll see these fines that FinTrack is issuing recently, and there is a backstory. The backstory is we want to look as good as possible for the FATF examination, because if we happen not to look good, we could get gray listed or blacklisted, as they refer to it, And that really means you become a country of interest. And country of interest is not a good thing for your economy. It's a hit on the economy because your credit rating goes down, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of organizations internationally looking at money laundering. FATF is the big one. You've got the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, et cetera. You've got NGOs, Transparency International, rates every country of the world annually. And then every country is supposed to have a financial intelligence unit. And since it's not going any further, I suspect that's because I hit the last slide. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on organized crime. And thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and happy to answer questions afterwards.
Do you have my deck?
Your deck is okay.
I think your deck is up.
Is it up? Okay.
It was on the flashback.
Get the text ordered.
No.
It doesn't matter. I can
Just while we're setting this up, I stacked against Joanne McNamara. Oh yeah, I see it. That Pete had to leave that on there, of course. Who's in charge of the civil forfeiture program here. Now we'll talk a little bit about civil forfeiture. That's my area of expertise. I will say to Pete's great presentation, one thing I might add, what has changed in the last 20 or 25 years ago? 25 years ago, we focused on cash, and I'm going to talk about cash. You see the picture on the thing. If you really want to understand money laundering now, you have to understand value, because there's lots of ways of moving value without moving cash, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to take you back about 10 years, roughly 10 years ago in Vancouver. And there's an undercover police officer, and he's working in the suburbs of Vancouver. And what he sees is a gentleman, we're going to call this gentleman Paul. He sees Paul do a hand-to-hand exchange of a luxury goods bag. And the luxury good bag goes to another guy, we'll call him the gambler. The gambler then takes that bag down to the Edgewater Casino, goes into the cage, and it's got $50,000 in $20 bills. Dumps the money out, goes in, and he gambles. And it turns out Paul is a really good loan shark. And what Paul has done is he's actually got a mortgage on the gambler's house. But it was sort of an opening vista into a lot of things that Peter actually was very pivotal in discussing, which is the misuse of casinos in British Columbia. And Paul was this guy, he was always around the casino. 2 in the morning, you had a bad luck streak. Don't worry, he's got a bag of money in the trunk, and he'll lend that to you, and away you go. And it got to the point where he was absolutely banned from all the gaming facilities in the Vancouver area. So what the police do is they assemble a great big team of investigators, there's analysts, there's forensic accountants. They call it E-Pirate. E is the division of the RCMP. Pirate's kind of a randomly chosen name. So at its peak, there are 300 law enforcement officials working on this project. It's massive. It's completely massive. Now, again, just want you to exercise your imagination just slightly. So picture a nondescript 3-story office building. This one's in Richmond, BC. And it's a place where you would go to see your chiropractor, maybe your dentist. And if you go up to unit 303 in the top, there's a small unit, and it's got like a public-facing thing with a counter, and then there's a back room. So I can go into the public-facing thing, and I can buy pesos, Mexican pesos, to do my vacation, or US dollars. And it takes me 10 or 15 minutes, to figure out ID and the debit card and all that kind of stuff. But the second line of business goes into the back room. And you've got guys with suitcases, rolling suitcases going into that back room, and they don't take 15 minutes. They take 3 minutes. They come in, they leave the suitcase, and they go. And these suitcases have got a lot of money in them. This suitcase has $1.4 million in Canadian cash, and it's one of many that are rolling through this place. And these guys don't stay, they don't ask for a receipt, because they don't have to, right? These guys, this is cartel money. This is Mexican cartel drug money that's coming into this particular MSB, money services business. And so cartels have their own enforcement mechanism, which usually involves some sort of a violent reaction. So people know that they're just going to have to deal with these guys. Here. Right, so police do a good job. And they charge Paul, and they charge the guys running this so-called MSB, money services business. Great, big, massive case. And as you know, in a criminal case, one of the challenges that law enforcement have is disclosure. And it makes sense, right? You know, if we're going to take someone and convict them, we have to disclose the full case. But what I think people don't maybe fully appreciate is how much there is. Think about what's on your phone. Then multiply that across 40 people in a network, and then you've got wiretaps, and you've got all the officers keeping their notes, all of those kinds of things. The disclosure is massive. And one thing that you have to do if you're in a project like this is you have to have really good people vetting the disclosure before it goes over to the defense lawyer. And what happens in this particular, we don't really know because the Crown never really explained why they withdrew the charges, but my understanding is an articling student in a criminal defense lawyer about 6 months later realized that they had disclosed information that related to a confidential informant. So in this world, if you have a confidential informant, they die, right? It's like they die. And that's just what happens because they're ratting out gangsters and they want to make an example of them. So the Crown then withdraws the charge, the case goes away, which is a really, and these guys were, you saw the suitcases, they were moving, I think, $220 million a year, at least that we know of. And what they were doing, and this is the important part about value. So as Peter said, you're selling drugs on the street, you're getting $20 bills. If you refine it, you get $50 or $100 bills. And they're collecting. So they have these cash collector networks and they're going into this particular MSB. And what these guys were doing was they were dealing with a different problem altogether. If you're in China, in 2016, China put hard currency controls to prevent flight capital from leaving the country. And you have these guys, and they are legitimate business people, and they run the factory in southern China that makes the crap we buy on Amazon or whatever. They've got all this money. They want to send their kid to UBC or Dow, and they want to have a condo for themselves and have a nest egg, or they want to go to the casino and just have fun. In fact, the ones that do go to the casino often just lose their money. So what happens is you have this little network. So they can fly to Vancouver, they can pick up literally a hockey bag of money, because at that time there were very poor controls. It's changed, thanks to Peter. But there were very poor controls, and they could literally go into the casino and buy in. And then what they would do in China, it's not illegal to send money to someone else within China, so they would do that transaction in China. And what gets it more interesting is you might also have a transaction between China and Mexico, where a company is making precursor chemicals, and they're sending it down to a cartel lab in Mexico. So you've got that part of the value chain, and then boom, it's coming up here. So you reconcile across this whole thing. And what's happened is these are professional money laundering networks that have displaced and completely changed the way that the money laundering business works these days. Oops, okay. Let's go back. So the case falls apart. What I will say is there's still a civil forfeiture case to Joanne's team. At least there's something happening, and that's with Paul, and he's fighting, and it's in the courts and whatever. It doesn't end there, though. So about a year after all of this stuff happens, there's this dinner in this restaurant, and all these organized crime people meet for dinner, and then one of them is killed. And he's killed through, like, it's that glasses. You see how it's mirrored. The shooter goes up to the glass, bang, bang, bang. Paul is there, and then the guy that ran Silver International is there. And of course, dead men don't tell tales, right? So the guy that ran Silver is killed, and I'm told Paul moved just before the shooter came in. So he got some glass and whatever. The shooter got paid $6,000. That's the price, right? $6,000 to kill another guy. So anyway, there you go. That's kind of the world that's working in. So what are we doing about all this kind of stuff? Well, first of all, I'm just going to talk about civil forfeiture. That's kind of what I know. As Rob said, I'm the first director of civil forfeiture in Canada. We have 9, about to have 10 jurisdictions here with a civil forfeiture process. There's one here in Nova Scotia. It goes back to about 2007, I think. It's largely not been used, but that's changing because there was Bill 134, which it passed in the legislature on the 2nd of October. And some of the things I'm going to talk about, techniques, will be available to Joanne and her team to do here in Nova Scotia. So what is civil forfeiture? It's a civil lawsuit. You bring it in a civil court, and you bring it against property. So you're not suing an individual at all. You're just dealing with the property itself, and your standard of proof is civil. Balance of probabilities, more likely or not. And we brought, when we started this 25 years ago, we brought the idea of admiralty idea. It's kind of funny word, Halifax, you can talk about admiralty. We brought this notion of in rem. So if you go back 500 years. A ship is in a harbor in Portsmouth, and it's gotten serviced by a ship's chandler. If the ship leaves the harbor, the ship's chandler is never going to get paid. So what the courts did in reaction to that was they got the notion of arresting the property. It's an in rem notion, so it prevents the ship. It doesn't matter who the captain is, you could never quite figure out who the owner is. It prevents it from leaving the harbor, and we've adopted this notion for civil forfeiture. So you'll have cases like Attorney General of Ontario versus $103,000. That's the defendant, is the cash itself. And we come into court and we say, this is a proceed of unlawful activity, which has a fairly broad definition. It's not just criminal code or Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, any unlawful activity, including provincial unlawful activity. And it's kind of based on a property theory in a way. If I'm a bank robber and I'm standing on the steps of the TD Bank, that name keeps coming up, the TD Bank with a cartoon cloth bag of money that I've stolen, I have no ownership claim. I might have some sort of a possessory claim, but it's wrong for me to claim that. And so we kind of take that idea when it comes to proceeds. I've made money from dealing with drugs, selling methamphetamine, selling fentanyl that are killing people in the community. I shouldn't have a claim to that property. But of course, there is a due process. So if I'm a putative owner, you've seized the money from me, we'll go to court and we'll sort all that kind of stuff out. So in 2009, the Supreme Court of Canada was asked to assess the constitutionality of this. And I can tell you, every defense lawyer I met was, Jeff, you're going to fail. It's going to fail. And it didn't. We got a 7-0 decision. And what the court said is this is properly a matter of civil law and properly a matter of property law. It might seem like it's punitive, it might seem like it's criminal, but it's not. And this is consistent with what courts have done in the UK, in Ireland, South Africa, Australia, and so on, all around the world. And we deal with two types of property generally in civil forfeiture. One is proceeds, the other is instruments. So that's a property that makes the labor of the crime possible. And we've now had a ruling, it's a BC Court of Appeal ruling on the Hells Angels, interestingly enough. Supreme Court of Canada refused to give leave. So that's kind of standing as the best precedent there. And of course, property can be both. As Peter said, like if you have a proceed of crime, you reinvest it. So it's a proceed when I make the money from the drugs, and then if I'm reinvesting it to go to a wholesaler to buy more drugs, then it's an instrument. So I have the sort of both nature to the property. Okay, I'm just going to see here. So one of the key elements of most of all civil forfeiture laws is the ability to freeze property. You've got cash, if you've got a bank account, it moves. And when it moves, it's hard to follow. Peter talked about that sort of layering and structuring. One of the things that organized crime understands is if I move it from here to the Caymans to Curacao over to Panama and back, it makes no economic sense. I'm paying a transfer on each time there's a jump. But we live in states, right? And so then we've got to figure out information. We've got to figure out how to figure out where that went, because it'll go into Curacao and it'll disappear unless Curacao tells us where it went next. And there are some places that are kind of adverse to doing that. So there's an ability to freeze it quickly, and that's freezing it often without a notice on an ex parte basis. And all of the civil forfeiture statutes, I think except maybe Alberta, have given courts residual discretion to refuse to make an order, where to do so would clearly not be in the interest of justice. One of the things that happened 25 years ago when we started all of this, people said, oh, you're going to have a beekeeper who has a technical violation of Beekeeper Act and you're going to take his farm. And of course, that never would happen. You're actually running a unit, you have very limited resources and you have very limited bandwidth. You'd never ever waste it on a spurious case. But what we've done is we've granted the court the residual discretion not to make an order. And then the most important thing as well is that if there are victims, and we've done a lot of fraud cases, the victims get the money. If it's a drug case, the money goes into a pool. It often goes back into law enforcement, and the Supreme Court of Canada was fine with that. But on fraud cases, all of the money goes back to the victims. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take you through one more wrinkle in this world of civil forfeiture. It's called an unexplained wealth order. There's one coming in Nova Scotia, there's one in place right now in Manitoba, and there's one in place in British Columbia. And Pete talked about intermediaries and gatekeepers like lawyers, and so that makes this one kind of interesting. So between 2015 and 2017, $3.5 million gets deposited into the trust account of a lawyer in Vancouver, a guy named Ronald Pelche. First lawyer, by the way, to be disbarred for money laundering. And Pelche actually says he knows his clients are fraudsters. They're all committing various types of securities fraud. So what he does is he says to them, if you want to settle, because you can settle civilly with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC in the United States, you show them your bank statements, but it won't include the money you've hidden in my trust account. And so one guy named Kevin Miller does this. So Kevin Miller joins up with a bunch of Confederates, and they have this little coffee company, and it's worthless. The shares are like 17 cents a share on no trading volume. And what they do is what's called a pump and dump. So they fraudulently promote this as a great buy, and they go to unsophisticated investors and they sell them the shares, and the shares go from 17 cents to I think $6.35 on trading of 20 million shares. So they make about $78 million. And then one of the ways that they do this, one of the ways that they violate the securities law, is they hide their ownership position. So Miller has a company in Panama and another company in the Marshall Islands. That is who you're buying the shares from. Of course it isn't, it's his. And then he makes his money makes its way into Peltier's account. And what happens with Peltier is he gets disbarred. It's fraud, and the Law Society of BC actually, to their credit, they go after him. And then he says to the Law Society, Miller, the guy, the UK national, thought to be living in Malta, says to the Law Society, hey, I want my money back. Where's my $3.5 million? I don't care about the guy being disbarred. Where's my money? And the Law Society of BC did not think much about that. So what they did was they gave the case to the Director of Civil Forfeiture. And what the Director of Civil Forfeiture has gotten is an order called a UWO, or an Unexplained Wealth Order. And it's an order of the court that says to Miller, to the UK national who was doing the securities fraud, where did that money come from? And it's tricky, right? Because you only have this sort of information window like this. It's bounced through it. We know it's bounced through these shell companies. We know it's bounced around the world. But now that puts the onus on Miller. So he's brought a really good lawyer to the court. They're challenging it. They've thrown every piece of spaghetti at the wall to try and challenge the viability of UWOs. The court has reserved. There's another drug case called Hwang where the court has issued the order, but we'll watch and see. And these are things and techniques that, if it's the right case, because that's only in a rare cohort of cases, we might see that in Nova Scotia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Rita. Just turn off the projector, Rita.
Oh,
Rita?
okay.
Do you want some podium? It's right there. You bring that over here.
Oh, okay.
Just because then the microphone's here. So
Okay.
watch this. This is how the magic happens.
All right. Okay, I will not spill my water on your stuff. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Rob, for inviting me to join these two excellent gentlemen. It's a little intimidating to follow these two. And I want to thank you also for the very kind introduction. And you talked about the fish-stealing cat being a point of continuity for what I write about today. I'll say the other point of continuity is the $10 that I was paid to write that story. It doesn't get much better than $10 in Canadian journalism. I hate to say that, but it's true. Nothing has changed. Okay, so I'll be talking about the corporate and political context of financial crime, and hopefully building on some of the things that have already been discussed today. But before I do that, I want to start off by giving you a bit of background about how I approach my work. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, much to my parents' chagrin, nor am I a police officer or a certified anti-money laundering specialist. Really, I am just a very nosy business journalist who is deeply troubled by what I like to call the shadier side of Bay Street, and also at the ease at which criminals operate in Canada's shadow economy. It really bothers me. And I really believe it's our responsibility, or my responsibility and my colleagues' responsibility as journalists, to shed light on the darker corners of the financial system. Okay, so there are plenty of reasons why we should be doing this, but I'm going to just give you three. Some corporations are actually complicit with bad actors. They don't have a problem with this because they make money out of it. It's about greed. The second reason is regulators and police, they're overextended and under-resourced. So journalists can play a role. And the third reason is our elected officials often appear willfully blind to the pervasiveness of financial crime, even though it presents public safety threat and existential threats to Canada. So I view money laundering through the lens of accountability journalism, and my goal is to create change. So what is the view from Bay Street? Okay, so businesses, including banks, are collectively spending billions of dollars each and every year on financial crime compliance. The amounts that are being spent keep going up, but that has not resulted in more convictions. Enforcement results, which include the number of investigations, charges, prosecutions, convictions, and asset forfeitures, declined between 2010 and 2020, and that's according to a report from the Department of Finance. At the same time, we have the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, known as FINTRAC for short. FINTRAC has been cracking the whip after years of giving many of these businesses what I like to call the kid glove treatment. It's actually a recipe for frustration for businesses. So in 2024-2025, FINTRAC issued 23 notices of violation of non-compliance to businesses for a total of more than $25 million. That was actually FINTRAC's busiest year on record. And earlier this month, as we heard earlier, FINTRAC announced its largest ever financial penalty, more than $176 million. That was levied against a BC registered business that operated a cryptocurrency exchange called Cryptomus. And it was given that financial penalty for failing to flag transactions allegedly linked to crimes that are pretty terrible, including trafficking of child sex abuse material, fraud, ransomware payments, and sanctions evasion. And we were talking about this at dinner. It's unclear to all of us whether that it seemed to all of us that FINTRAC really just does not have a viable way to obtain this money, collect this money from this business. This business doesn't have any employees in Canada, no assets here. So was it all for PR? Is it a PR exercise? Well, FINTRAC, of course, has made a show of slapping these financial penalties on Canadian banks, although they paid considerably smaller amounts than $176 million. And so I'll give you an example. Back in January of 2024, my colleague Stephanie Marotta and I, we landed a scoop. We reported that FINTRAC was preparing to hit TD Bank with a financial penalty in excess of $10 million. That's because FINTRAC had held a compliance examination that found that the lender had faulty anti-money laundering controls. So FINTRAC had completed this assessment of TD in late 2023 and deemed its anti-money laundering compliance to be unsatisfactory. So I have to say, the Globe and Mail is not identifying the sources. We have put this in all of our stories because they were not authorized to speak to us on the record about regulatory issues. So they're not anonymous sources, they're confidential sources. Anonymous sources suggest that we don't know who they are. We know who they are and why they've chosen to speak to us. So when I talk about sources, for much of this talk, I am talking about confidential sources. So I just wanted to say that up front. So at the time of the publication of that first story, FINTRAC had already shared its preliminary findings with TD, and it was preparing its final report about the compliance deficiencies, according to 5 sources familiar with the matter. Those people told us that FINTRAC had conducted an end-to-end assessment of TD's anti-money laundering controls. And as is typical with these bank appraisals, the regulator vetted a very large sample of TD's suspicious transaction reports, and it also evaluated its compliance policies and procedures, including its training for staff. Now, FINTRAC apparently paid particular attention to TD's Canadian Financial Intelligence Unit. Now, this financial intelligence unit, which exists within the bank, it does tactical work such as the monitoring of suspicious transactions and case investigations. But there was a problem. There was friction between the bank's compliance officers who were trying to do the right thing and the bank's lawyers. And this friction and conflict had contributed to the bank's regulatory problems. at least 3 of the sources told us. Now, the discord stemmed from a disagreement over privacy and permissible information sharing. TD's lawyers had generally taken a very conservative view of privacy legislation, especially the Federal Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, according to the sources. And that strict interpretation of the Act, which limits the collection and use of customer information, affected the bank's disclosures, including to regulators, according to the sources. Now, under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, banks and other businesses are required to submit suspicious transaction reports to FINTRAC if there are, quote, reasonable grounds to suspect, end quote, that a transaction or an attempt to transaction is related to money laundering or terrorist financing activity, and it really doesn't matter the monetary value. Regardless of that, they're required to disclose. So there's apparent, competing goals that the bank is looking at. They have these 2 pieces of federal legislation, and the lawyers are looking at and saying, okay, well, it looks like PIPEDA trumps Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, which is not what was intended when those acts were created. The compliance officers were getting frustrated because they were trying to do the right thing, as I mentioned, but they were outranked by the bank's lawyers. And TD's chief anti-money laundering officer previously reported into the bank's general counsel. So that reporting line changed in March of 2022 when the anti-money laundering division was moved to the lender's risk department under the oversight of the chief risk officer. So some of this had to do with reporting lines. But by the time of the story's publication, TD's appeals process with FINTRAC for this fine that was supposed to be in excess of $10 million, the appeals process had yet to expire. And the bank, we would later learn, pushed back behind closed doors, and FINTRAC reduced the amount. Months later, in May of 2024, FINTRAC announced that TD's financial penalty was going to be more than $9.18 million, and that penalty was for 5 violations of the Act. But unlike the cryptocurrency exchange case that I mentioned earlier, FINTRAC disclosed in this instance that TD had already paid the full amount of that penalty. So that's why there's some doubt as to whether this crypto thing was a PR exercise. Later that same month, my colleague Stephanie and I got another scoop about TD. This time, we reported that Canada's banking regulator had ordered TD to repair the nerve center for its risk controls. So the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, or OSFI, had identified deficiencies with TD's regulatory compliance management program during an assessment. And that's according to 2 people familiar with the matter. The RCM framework, as it's known for short, is a set of controls that banks use and they must have in place to avoid running afoul of the various laws and regulations governing their operations in Canada, the US, and any other country that they operate in. It is actually considered by OSFI to be a crucial element of a financial institution's overall risk management program, and it also includes technology, processes, and other oversight functions. Anti-money laundering is just one of the regulatory compliance risks that banks are required to manage through an effective RCM program. Some of the weaknesses detected in OSFI's evaluation of TD involved the bank's anti-money laundering controls, according to 2 of the sources. So, why is this important? The proactive testing of controls is the cornerstone of an effective RCM program for banks. That risk-based testing creates a feedback loop for the bank's individual businesses. The business units are then supposed to take the information that's gleaned to fix any weaknesses. In TD's case, failures of its risk-based testing may have led to faulty controls, according to one of the sources. So TD's problems, as we would learn later, with this RCM framework actually dated back many years. In 2015, its RCM program was supported by Thomson Reuters. The bank, however, experienced a big software problem, and that required a rebuild of its RCM program. Now, I have to give you a bit of disclosure. Woodbridge Company, the Thompson family's holding company, and Woodbridge is also the controlling shareholder of Thomson Reuters. Well, it also owns the Globe and Mail. So Thomson Reuters declined to comment for our story in the Globe. So back to this timeline. In 2016, TD replaced the Thomson Reuters platform with one from Archer Technologies, which is based in the United States. The bank, though, experienced big problems during the implementation process. But it wasn't because there was something wrong with the Archer platform. Banks sometimes experience these major technology glitches when trying to pair new technologies with their legacy systems. It happens all the time. Archer, I have to also tell you, did not provide comment for our story. So this wasn't the first time that OSFI had flagged problems with TD's approach to anti-money laundering, to managing its anti-money laundering risks. OSFI officials had raised the matter directly with then Chief Executive Officer Ed Clark in 2010 and 2011. Back then, both Canadian and US regulators had identified numerous deficiencies with TD's AML program. So we learned all of this from sources, confidential sources. In fact, the bank's regulatory troubles were detailed in a case study that was included in a policy guide written by the Financial Action Task Force. Now, TD was not named in the case study, but it was plainly obvious that this case study was about TD having problems with regulators on both sides of the border, and our sources independently confirmed that TD was the bank. So then in 2012, the bank's executives participated in this three-way meeting with one of TD's American regulators, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and also OSFI. The point of this meeting was to coordinate remedial action. Embarrassed by the lapses in its AML program, then CEO Ed Clark promised a revamp. And by 2013, OSFI had determined the bank had fixed most of its deficiencies, and the regulator concluded that executives were committed to resolving the rest. So the question is then, how did TD go backwards from there? Well, according to many sources, the answer is multifaceted. To start with, a new CEO took over in late 2014, and as these things usually go, an executive shuffle followed. Then there was a major restructuring at the bank in 2015. And then the following year, TD, as I previously told you, replaced its regulatory compliance management program with the platform from Archer. And as I previously said, that implementation was a disaster. So as these integration woes dragged on, TD's new leadership and its board of directors did not maintain the same commitment to anti-money laundering, according to our various sources. There were concerns within the bank that the program was being treated as a cost center rather than an essential service. American regulators, meanwhile, were losing their patience with the bank. They had slapped TD with a $37.5 million US fine in 2013, resulting from the bank's failure to file suspicious activity reports for accounts linked to the Scott Rothstein Ponzi scheme in South Florida. TD was also entangled in another U.S. scandal due to its correspondent banking relationship with Stanford International Bank. That was another massive Ponzi scheme. The bank settled that matter in 2023 for $1.21 billion US. So our reporting at the Globe and Mail also revealed that in 2024, then Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland had instructed Canadian financial regulators, including OSFI and FINTRAC, to get on it and resolve any and all outstanding problems at TD Bank. The reason? The Americans had raised concerns about the bank's ability to identify financial crime. US regulators also questioned why their Canadian counterparts, including at FINTRAC and OSFI, previously failed to spot and remedy problems with TD's anti-money laundering risk controls. We were told one of the questions posed is, why do we keep finding problems with these Canadian banks that you're in charge of? OSFI and FINTRAC both report to Canada's finance minister, who is now François-Philippe Champagne. Of course, FINTRAC's near $9.2 million financial penalty that was imposed on TD is a mere fraction of what the bank was required to pay for its spectacular money laundering failures in the United States. Last year, TD paid $3 billion in fines after becoming the first bank in the United States to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering. TD also became the largest bank in U.S. history to plead guilty to failing to maintain an anti-money laundering program that complies with U.S. federal regulations. It's because of narcotics. So news that TD, one of Canada's largest banks, was caught up in a global drug war was stunning. But the details of the case were even more so. The criminals routinely deposited bundled stacks of US dollars, similar to the slides that we saw previously, at multiple branches in New York in the borough of Queens. All told, the criminal ring's leader moved more than 470 million US dollars, all illicit funds, through TD branches, all in the US over a 3-year period. That is just an eye-popping amount of money. The bank received a public dressing down by then US Attorney General Merrick Garland. If you haven't seen this press conference, you need to watch it. It caused jaws to drop across Canada. Merrick Garland was, let me say, blunt is the charitable way of describing it. He said, quote, TD Bank created an environment that allowed financial crime to flourish. By making its services convenient for criminals, it became one, end quote. In other words, TD, according to the Americans, had become a criminal enterprise because of its culture of greed and its corporate governance failures, despite repeated warnings from regulators on both sides of the border. Executives and board members had dropped the ball. Fentanyl and narcotics trafficking, as we know, has exploded over the past decade. And as we heard, Mexican cartels that manufacture drugs are awash with US cash that needs to be laundered. To do so, as Peter explained, they hired criminal rings, such as the one that laundered the money through TD. And so they often pay a 1 to 2% cut of the proceeds as a commission. It's a lot of money. Now, the bank, which has a new CEO, is really eager to move past its US money laundering problems. But as I've written in the Globe, Canada's second largest bank still hasn't really provided the public with a clear answer about what went wrong in the first place. We've been told there were procedural failings, bad apples, people who didn't follow ethics codes, but we don't really have a clear answer from the bank about what went wrong. And as I've also written in the Globe, while we were reporting out this story, the bank's PR department, its spin doctors, also spent many months haranguing journalists as the story unfolded. Now, for me to tell you that, it's a pretty significant thing because journalists don't like to be part of the story. But the type of treatment we received was so offensive to us in terms of the work that we were trying to do, which was in the public interest, that my editors okayed me. They let me put that in a column, and that column actually won an award earlier this year. The bank's PR department would actually question the newsworthiness of these AML stories. We were told routinely, we don't understand why this is news. I mean, you could just imagine the looks on our faces when we're getting that kind of messaging. The US Department of Justice's revelations were shocking, precisely because the bank had spent many years glossing over the scope of its money laundering failures in the United States. Executives repeatedly said that there were no problems at the enterprise level. But how does that square with the US Federal Reserve Board's demand that TD conduct a thorough and independent review of its board of directors and management to ensure adequate oversight of its US operations? There was also a separate requirement that TD relocate to the United States parts of its anti-money laundering compliance program that are responsible for complying with US law. That was a huge black eye for Canadian regulators, including OSFI and FINTRAC. The Federal Reserve Board stated the following in its press release, quote, "This program will be subject to oversight by US regulators," end quote. That quote alone speaks volumes about the loss of confidence the Americans have in Canada's regulatory regime. So earlier this month, we had Finance Minister Champagne, trying to signal a new tone from the top in Ottawa. And one of the things he announced, as Peter talked about, and Jeff, that the long-delayed Financial Crimes Agency will use funding for the RCMP to create a specialized team focused on money laundering and online fraud. When Mr. Champagne was asked by journalists, what took so long to make good on this promise, he said, "I'm taking over now, so it's going to happen." Okay. It's more likely that Ottawa's renewed interest was sparked by Donald Trump. President Trump is clearly fighting a war of attrition with Canada. He is making noises, we've heard him say this repeatedly, about American banks being disadvantaged in Canada. Let's set aside for a second whether or not there's the truth of that. I mean, clearly American banks do operate in the Canadian market. But we still need to pay close attention to what Donald Trump has to say. Because, and here's the reason, with a stroke of a pen, the US Secretary of the Treasury can designate a Canadian bank as a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act. Once designated, no American bank can engage in a transaction or commercial relationship with that bank. Immediately after designation, the bank loses the ability to transact in US dollars, and no US correspondent bank in New York will engage with that bank. We won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Now, to be clear, losing USD payment clearing ability would cripple any Canadian bank's ability to transact in the United States. That is their main growth market. And importantly, because of the US trade war, it would also hurt Canada's ability to conduct trade with the United States and other countries. So some of you are thinking, this can't happen. I'm going to ask you to think again, because there is already a precedent for Washington, which has labeled previously a Canadian bank a major money laundering concern by invoking that section of the Patriot Act. It's already happened. So I'm going to take you in my time machine back in time. Lebanese Canadian Bank, which was also, much like TD, the primary responsibility of Canadian regulators. That bank was hit with Section 311 back in 2011. And that was over its ties to global narcotics trafficking, a related money laundering network, and Hezbollah. The criminal network moved illegal drugs from South America to Europe and the Middle East via West Africa. Hence the transnational nature of a lot of this stuff. It also laundered hundreds of millions of dollars monthly through accounts held at Lebanese Canadian Bank. It engaged in bulk cash smuggling, used Lebanese exchange houses, and washed the proceeds of crime through trade-based money laundering. Washington, at the time, also found evidence that Hezbollah derived financial support from the criminal activities. Lebanese Canadian Bank was based in Beirut, and it maintained a network of 35 branches in Lebanon. its representative office was in Montreal. In fact, if you go back even further, it operated as a subsidiary of the Royal Bank of Canada from 1968 to 1988 before becoming a privately owned Lebanese bank. So, as you heard earlier from my two colleagues, the esteemed gentlemen here, Ottawa is facing another very thorny political challenge as Canada, prepares for this FATF review. As Peter talked about, lawyers have been exempted from reporting suspicious transactions to FINTRAC for a decade. There was a 2015 Supreme Court of Canada decision that found that Ottawa's previous reporting requirements could subject lawyers to unreasonable search and seizure or incarceration if they refused to violate solicitor-client privilege, including by handing over records. That ruling, however, as many of you would know, left the door open for Ottawa to revise its legislation so that it aligns with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Of course, the government never pursued that course of action, even though I'm told the RCMP begged them to do it. So, lawyers have maintained their own anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing rules ever since. And while I'm sure any upstanding lawyer would certainly terminate a client relationship if they suspected they were being tricked into assisting with money laundering or other financial crimes, let's get real, those concerns are unlikely to be reported to the police. And this is precisely why report after report has concluded that the exclusion of lawyers from the federal anti-money laundering regime is an impediment to Canada's ability to combat financial crime. The FATF itself has said it constitutes a significant loophole. And that concern has been echoed by others, especially when it comes to money laundering in the real estate market. Because, as you heard earlier, real estate transactions usually involve lawyers and their trust accounts. And thanks to Peter's great work, it came up at the Cullen Commission. Now, Peter, in one of the many reports that he's written for the BC government, he had a great quote, which I've used in my columns. He said, "Lawyers are the black hole of real estate and of money movement generally, with no visibility by law enforcement on what enters and leaves a lawyer's trust account. Many investigations are stymied." Peter also argued that at the very least there must be visibility into the financial accounts maintained by lawyers. He wrote, quote, "There is no suggestion that privileged solicitor-client communications should be impacted." I'm going to take his word for it since I'm not a lawyer, but I believe that him to be right, because as he pointed out, other countries have dealt with this issue successfully. So it'll be really interesting to see whether the FATF highlights this issue again in this year's review. And as you probably gathered, there is much hand-wringing going on in Ottawa right now because of this FATF review. I'm told there are prep sessions going on this week. There is concern that the TD case in particular is casting a pall over the review. Canadian regulators, Austrian FINTRAC, are expected to be put on the hot seat, according to our sources. Now, it's easy to say single out TD, but to be fair to the bank, it is far from alone in having these types of problems. Over the course of my career, I've written numerous stories and columns about money laundering, and some of those pieces are about how banks, also including RBC, Scotia, Home Capital, you name it, have run into trouble with regulators for having faulty financial crime controls. Other stories, including recent money laundering exposés about the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, Canada, have highlighted the growing nexus between illicit financial flows and foreign interference through the banking system. This is an emerging area of risk that people need to be paying attention to. The stories that we produced, some of the cases that were involved, one involved a Chinese bomb maker that was on the US sanctions list that remained a client of this bank, and large sums of money flowed in and out of the country via this Canadian arm of the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. And if you don't know, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is the largest bank in the world. Another one of their clients was a Pakistani state-owned bank that was implicated in a massive money laundering scandal in that country in 2019 that led to its head government officials being tossed into prison. Huge sums of money flowed into Canada. It was truly shocking. So I know what some of you must be thinking. Isn't Canada's banking system one of the soundest in the world? But as you heard earlier, it is exactly that perception of Canadian banks being sound and Canada having strong privacy legislation and a reputation for being a rule of law country that gives financial criminals the ability to hide in plain sight. And I will say that the regulatory secrecy that shrouds banks and other businesses has created a false sense of security for Canadians. It has made us complacent in fighting financial crime. And my argument has always been that we can and we absolutely must do better. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Rita. So a couple of things there. Just picking up on the point Rita made about what's happening in terms of lawyers being able to comply with their obligations. These self-regulated professional bodies across the country, as we are, having compliance obligations in a sense. Just this week, the Nova Scotia Barrister Society has introduced a mandatory anti-money laundering course for all practicing lawyers in the province, which is a big deal. Was that too inspired by the FATF review? I'm not sure. One other thing I want to say is I want to speak particularly to our students here tonight, who I'm very pleased to see. Thank you for coming. If what you're hearing tonight is there's a lot of money to be made in money laundering, that is not the message I wanted you to take away. We've got time for questions. The thing with this room is that the blowers are always going, and so the microphones are really important. So what I'll do is take a question or maybe two, and then whichever of our guests wants to have a cut at it, I'll invite them up, but we'll sort of have to hover around the mic a little bit. So, questions? Yes.
I would like to know what you think is going to happen. Because in the past, it seems that the U.S. and Europe and Canada have all cooperated on large transnational money laundering issues. They've shared intelligence. But Mr. Trump has basically gone through and fired all of the people who were doing this in the United States. His executive orders have made some of the anti-corruption laws not applicable anymore. And he can't rip it out, but he effectively has done that. So you're sitting with what has been a major trade partner in Canada and a relatively well integrated set of economies, where one half is as corrupt as it can possibly be and glorifying it. At the same time, you're quite worried that you don't want to be seen as being facilitating corruption. So I'd like to hear how you feel about this and what you see Canada's path forward.
So one thing I'll do is, because we're recording the session as well, I'll briefly restate the questions as they come in. And that one I take to be, while there's a lot of disruption coming to the entire financial crime enforcement world from the Trump government right now, what is Canada to do with this ally that is now stirring waters? Great to find. Whichever one of our speakers wants to jump in on that.
I'll go first.
So,
I was actually a little curious why there was a Roman centurion sitting here. And then all of a sudden I realized Halloween's coming, isn't it? So yeah, okay, it all made sense when he was walking out. I couldn't quite figure it out at first. So anyway, look, Canadian law enforcement has worked extremely well with American law enforcement for many years. And those of you that have a background in law enforcement would know that. Really, that as we refer to in law, the comedy between the nations and between law enforcement has always been extremely strong. The issue that Canada has had recently with U.S. law enforcement is, from our perspective, at our end, our disclosure laws are so stringent, and our privacy laws are so stringent, that in many cases we don't want to take information from the U.S. authorities because we can't disclose it. It comes with caveats of one sort or another. So increasingly the Americans realize that Canada's got all these different restrictions once they get information from us. But that issue aside, I think generally speaking, regardless of who the president is, the comedy still exists between law enforcement. But to get more to your question, yeah, if the Americans aren't doing these big cases any longer, like corruption cases, does that mean Canada can't do them? No, we can still do them, and presumably the Americans would still assist us through, let's say, mutual legal assistance and so forth. There are mechanisms for that. It doesn't mean that we have to shut down what we do. Unfortunately, we don't do that much of it successfully. Picking up on, for example, the cases that Jeff was talking about, whereas the Americans have always been a bit of a bright, shining light in this area. They do an extremely good job of dealing with white-collar crime. We might not like their sentencing regime and things like that, but they do a very good job of it. So it's unfortunate because there also is that ripple effect around the world. If America's not going to deal with corruption, well, why should the rest of us? Because it was America that got us all going down this road with their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They said, hey, we're going to tell our businesses not to corrupt foreign public officials. Now we want the rest of the world to do that. And that's what led to the different corruption conventions. So unfortunately, we now are almost in the reverse of that, Jeff.
Really good question. Just two really quick observations. So Peter talked about disclosure. One of the problems is if we're working with an organized crime law enforcement unit in California, and they bring the case up here, and they have those confidential informants, and they've got techniques that they use. And if I'm the Canadian prosecutor or investigator receiving that, I can't promise it won't get disclosed. That's what Peter was kind of averting to with that. I think there's one other problem that Trump is creating. It's a long-term one. Is he's hollowing out law enforcement. So I have a really good friend, Steve Welk. Pete and I brought him to an asset forfeiture conference in California. He's from California, Southern District of California. Trump gets elected. He puts an AUSA, the presiding U.S. attorney in charge that everyone hates. And the U.S. attorney said, well, if you don't like me, walk out. 31 experienced prosecutors walked out of the office in the Southern District of California. And these are guys with 10, 20, 30 years. You can't replace those people. And so I think this hollowing as a deliberate, Plan 2025 or whatever the heck they called that, it's a planned, deliberate thing. I think it'll take a long time, regardless of who the president is, for us to recover from that.
Okay, I'm going to add something, but from a different perspective. I think this is going to be pose a real problem for Canada in terms of its goal, the Prime Minister's state goal of doubling our non-U.S. exports, okay, over a decade. And the reason I say that is because of trade-based money laundering. And so what the real risk is if Canada doesn't do something about this, like get its own house in order, and if there's a perception by Trump that we are failing in some way, it is going to make it very, very difficult for us to negotiate even a favorable update to the USMCA agreement that's currently in place. And the reason I say this is the last time Trump was in power and we had the USMCA agreement, the U.S. baked clauses into that that had to do with forced labor. And so companies suddenly had to disclose whether they had in their supply chain forced labor. And that changed. It was a Canadian law that was created, but it was created in direct response to what the Americans asked for in that USMCA agreement. And other countries all around the world are increasingly including what is known as transparency clauses in their trade agreements. So there's the transparency clause that exists in the CETA agreement that Canada has with the European Union. I believe our trade deal with Ecuador has one, And so this is a growing trend. So if there's a perception that Canada is not kind of a rule of law country and that there is money laundering going on through the trading system and we're not taking these things seriously as a country, our ability to actually achieve that goal is in jeopardy. And so this brings us back to money laundering being an existential threat to Canada, not just from a public safety point of view and terrorist financing, but in terms of our own economic security.
On that sobering note, other questions? Yes.
1979, 2 people died at my house. I knew them. The other gentleman offered me a position as in the inspection division of the Canadian subsidiary of a giant multinational. What it really was detecting fraud in the container business. And so my job would be, I had an office in the Doyle building. I had a desk, a telephone, and a large pair of board cutters, and a telex machine that kept me in contact with the rest of the world if I needed to send a message. My job was, I'd go down the container terminal every day, go in the office and certain shipping companies, and they would have the sheets showing me the boxes and the alert and what was supposed to be inside. I quickly learned which boxes were inside because I knew it was a freight forward. Still in business today. And I raise this because when the incidents of stolen vehicles came up, my first thought was, it's not cars that steal, it's what's inside the car or has been put inside the car that shipping. And so the bill of lading would show the ship, would show the goods, the freight forwarder, where it was going to. But that doesn't mean that if it said it was going to Hamburg, it doesn't mean that it went to Hamburg, or that Hamburg was the ultimate destination. Because it's quite popular. It's not unusual in trade for the product of the inside to be sold en route and sold several times on its way to one port. Where it goes after, say, Hamburg, Le Havre, Southampton. And so if I wanted a box call, I usually just get on the telex, send a message to any of those places and ask our people over there to pull the box and check what was inside. So when they seem to tell us about cars being stolen in Canada, I would say, I'm pretty sure it's not the vehicle. All you can do is steal that vehicle, take it where you are, change the seat, go inside, take part of a panel out, stuff a bunch of drugs in, put a panel back in, and send it up to wherever you want. But some of them, I've seen it on the W5 about all of these vehicles were found in West Africa. And I was like, yeah, we found it ridiculous. We didn't get from Halifax. We went through the ports. So, but the funniest part was one day I'm crawling around a 20 to 40 foot box in a container terminal hotel. And I had to I'm in there and I'm checking what's in there as against what the bill of lading is saying. And while I'm in there, I keep shouting. My instructions when I was hired was, you don't tell anybody what to do. People that need to, even I wouldn't have to tell them. So I usually shout, eventually I got cigarettes. I got out of the box. No, no, we had two gentlemen in suits in the parking lot. Fence. Hey, what you doing? What you doing? And I'm like, none of your business. Then he kept on. thought, just playing the same. So eventually I went over the fence and I said, what are you doing? I said, it's none of your business. It's none of your business. Went back and forth like this, and I could see one was getting really agitated, so I kept winding him up. And then then he said, oh, we're RCMP officers. And I said, yes, and I'm Mickey Mouse. And I said, he said, no, we're RCMP officers. Well, my father was a police officer. He took his word card, whether he was on duty or not. So I said to her, show me your, these two guys, show me your warrant cards. I said, can you stop everything, show me the other, your warrant card, and you'll get this done. So they put business card in, you know, and I said, detective sergeant, service remote, and 301, and just and I'm like, Jesus, I'm ready to say, sorry, boss, that's all nice, have a nice day, it's none of your business. Because it was harvest board police were in charge. I went back to the office, did some paperwork, and I thought about it. I thought, what if these guys are frauds? So I got my car, I went up to Oxford Street, the RCMP headquarters, went into the desk, and the young police lady came in, can I help you, sir? I said, yes. I said, 2 males claiming to be RCMP officers. And I told her the story, and I told her the positions of the names. And she said to me, oh, there's nobody like that here. Nobody with that name? Yes, yes. I said, so well, we got a serious problem. And I told her, she went over to talk to her supervisor. And then she came back to me, took me upstairs where the detectives were. She opened the door, and the mouthy one, he was sitting there, and he looked at me. He was fuming. And I just said to him,
You know, I really want to be able to get our speakers to bounce out
what I'm
on
saying is, the fraud, if you see it, right, because you're not seeing, you want to see part of it.
when the mayor's going on.
And it's well beyond Canada.
This is why, and this bounces us right into trade-based money laundering. Could you ever say a word about that? Because it's come up a couple of times, and I'm not sure that we're all on the same page with what trade-based money
What I
laundering.
really like to talk about is those telex machines, because they were great, weren't they? If only we had telex machines today, that sort of thing. And, yeah, my first detachment in Grand Falls, Newfoundland, I had arrived there and I didn't want to be there. And then I'm a constable with about a week's service, and I'm working the night shift. Art, you would know all about this. And the telex machine sets off, and this is in the 70s. And it says, Constable German, your point, rumor transferred to Bay d'Espoir, which is the south coast of Newfoundland. And I went, oh my God. And I almost had a heart attack. And then a little while later, the fellows from Night Patrol came in. They'd been at the Mount Peyton Hotel in Grand Falls, typing a message to me in the hotel. So you can do a lot of things with those telex machines. But look, let's just talk about vehicles for one quick minute, and then your question, Rob. While you folks were worrying about vehicles outbound, and it was a real issue in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, and probably still is to a certain degree, what we were concerned about was fentanyl coming into Canada from Asia and precursors coming in. So, environment, because of our geography and so forth, there were different issues going on in Vancouver from here. But one of the issues that came up was the fact that we have no port police in Canada. We used to have the National Harbors Board Police, then we had Ports Canada Police, but since 1997, none. There are no police in our ports. It's a responsibility of the municipal authorities, and oftentimes it's something that they have to do off the side of their desk. Rita's written about it. I've written about it. It's a huge gap in our system. Trade-based money laundering is reportedly, and Jeff, you probably have better insight on this than I do. It's supposedly the largest form, most prevalent form of money laundering in the world. And really, it's all about under and over invoicing and various different techniques where you can essentially disguise the cost of shipments and therefore move money somewhat expeditiously. Yeah.
Just really quickly to explain this. So Colombia doesn't just export cocaine. They export emeralds. And what's interesting about emeralds is there are grades. I'm not a gemologist, but there are grades between like really lousy ones that might be worth $1 and really good ones that are worth 100. And what they'll do is they will to ship. Remember, money laundering is about value, so they will ship low grade emeralds, say they're worth $1, to Canada, and they come to me, and I pay for them as high grade. So now I'm paying them $100. I just moved $99, and you can extrapolate the money any you like. I've moved that value back to Colombia, and if Officer German comes after and says, I'm just exporting, just in the emerald, I'm just a gem guy. I'm a legitimate gem guy. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to give you a better example. Artwork.
Yeah, artwork
Has become the classic money laundering device. Because of course, the value of painting, it's what you pay for it, right?
Yeah.
And so they, because this has become such a big issue that the big auction houses have tried to sell these. They haven't done a very good job of it.
Yeah, and so with artwork and with trade, you have these free trade zones, and they're all over the world, Dubai, whatever, and they're really risky because there's low friction, right? They want the trade code, and with art, it's safe ports. So there's a place in Switzerland which is a safe port where you can store your art, and there's bazillion dollars worth of art there, and I mean, you're right, it's another way of moving.
Well, I wanted to ask the question because a lot of times the art goes into these free ports. It's stored there. I mean, can you seize that art? Because we know for sure it's owned by a Russian oligarch or whatever. Somebody who's, I mean, you know.
It's really hard to get cooperation. It's hard to know it's actually there, and then it can be done. It can be done, and the Swiss are actually getting better than they used to be, but it is very hard to do.
I don't really have anything to add except to say that trade-based money laundering really is the dark side of globalization, because this was supposed to create an opportunity for legitimate businesses to make more money and enter new markets, and unfortunately, it also has created an opening for the criminals. So that's the only thing I would add to what they said.
Looking at the clock, I think we've got time for one more. There's some great discussion breaking out.
Just a basic level.
Yeah.
We talked about taking suitcases into a casino. If I do that, I lose the money in the casino. So how do I get money back out? Like how do you launder it if you lose it on the slots?
So the guy that loses the money doesn't care. You got to understand, he's not the criminal. He's a legitimate Chinese businessman. He runs a factory in China. He wants a fun weekend in the River Rock Casino in Vancouver. So he doesn't care, right? He loses his money. What he does care about, though, is he cannot export, say $200,000 from China to Vancouver. Can't. There's currency controls. He can't get it through. But what he can do is he can spend $200,000 within China, which may go to a company that does precursor chemicals, and then boom, they go through the cycle, and he picks up the drug money. He doesn't care if it's drug money. He doesn't know. He's just having fun. I mean, that's a large part of what the Columnist Commission had found.
And the other thing to keep in mind about casinos, we used to think in policing that, organized crime will not use casinos. That was the prevailing view going back a couple of decades, because you always lose money in the casino. The algorithms are such that you're going to lose, and some, depending on what game you play and so forth. But then you have to recognize that any money laundering organization will take a cut. So whether it's 5%, 10%, 15%, it's no different than an algorithm in a casino. So even if you are actually using a casino for money laundering, it's actually, it can make a lot of sense, because you're going to lose money because you're not going to win all the time. You'll lose 5%, 7%, whatever it might be. It's actually not a bad deal when you consider how much it costs to launder money through other means.
And if you have a poker table and you control all the players in the poker table, one guy wins. Yes, 9 guys lose, but the winner has laundered the money. So you've controlled the outcome. Yes, they've lost their money. They really haven't.
I'll just add one other point. So I think we saw recently FinTrack find one of the provincial gaming corporations for anti-money laundering failures. So to me, this is very interesting because it has brought to light this competition between the provinces and the feds over whose jurisdiction is whose and who's in charge of what. And that kind of tension we have seen between provinces and the federal government is the reason why we don't have, let's say, a national securities regulator. So I think that if we continue to see FinTrack going after the provincial gaming corps, we'll see more of that pushback from the provinces. It'll be interesting to see where they cooperate and where they don't.
So I can't imagine a better place at which to lead this discussion in a Canadian law school than to say, what's a major source of friction? Federalism. This has been an amazing evening. And normally at this point I bring out gift bags and I would present them to our speakers, but we're going with an alternative approach where we're going to make a donation to a charity of the choice of each of our speakers, a virtual speaker's gift. So for now, I wonder if you would join me in thanking them. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday night.